Something is rattling around like a walnut inside a shell. And as they look within, an 8,000-year-old skull, that of a 45-year-old woman.
Back in 1982, archaeologists exploring a deep Florida swamp made an impossible discovery. They found a skull that should have been nothing more than dry, fragile bone. But inside was something no one expected. A preserved brain that was still recognizable after about 8,000 years. Similar elongated skulls have been found in different parts of the world. But when scientists tested the DNA from these ancient remains, the results were even more surprising. So, what did the DNA reveal? And why did it leave scientists stunned? Titusville discovery. The summer heat in Florida can be brutal. In 1982, the town of Titusville was busy with a new housing project called Windover Farms. Heavy machinery was digging into the ground, building roads and large ponds to collect rainwater for future homes. For the workers, it was just another normal day on the job. Nobody expected something from thousands of years ago to come out of the ground. One of the workers, a man named Steve Vanderjaart, was operating a backhoe over a wet, muddy area. His job seemed simple. He needed to dig a shallow pond that would help control rainwater. But as the machine dug deeper into the dark soil, it suddenly hit something and stopped. Steve thought he had hit a rock. That was already a little strange because Florida's ground is usually soft and sandy. Curious about what was underneath, he climbed out of the machine to take a closer look. As he knelt beside the hole, Steve reached into the mud and pulled something out. It was a human skull. The skull was brown, wet, and covered in mud from spending countless years underground. At first, Steve thought he might have discovered the remains of a recent crime. The sight shocked him. Later, he said he felt strangely cold even though the Florida heat was intense that day. It almost felt as if he had uncovered something that had been hidden for a reason. Steve immediately told his supervisor, who contacted the authorities. Within an hour, police officers arrived and blocked off the area. When they looked into the hole, they could already see other bones sticking out of the mud. The officers began to suspect that they had found an old grave. Titusville had its share of missing people and dark stories, so the idea of human remains did not seem impossible. For a short time, some even wondered if they had discovered the remains of several murder victims. But then the county coroner took a closer look at the skull. The bone was soft and crumbly. Its color had become dark after spending years buried in wet soil. It clearly did not look like the remains of someone who had died recently. The coroner soon realized that this was not a modern death. Whatever had happened here, it had happened far beyond living memory. Construction was stopped immediately. To their credit, the developers did not try to ignore the discovery. Instead, they provided money, equipment, and pumps to help protect the area. They wanted the remains to be properly studied and preserved. At this point, this was no longer just a police investigation. It had become a major historical discovery. Archaeologists were soon brought in to investigate the site. One of them was Dr. Glenn Doran, a young anthropologist from Florida State University. He would soon become one of the most important people in the investigation. At first, Doran did not think the site looked very special. To someone without archaeological training, it looked like nothing more than a muddy pond filled with dark water, moss, and wet soil. But once the digging started, everything changed. Suddenly, there were more questions than answers. Why had people been buried in the middle of a swamp? How had their fragile bones survived Florida's extreme heat and humidity, conditions that normally destroy human remains within a few decades? And if these bones had survived for so long, what else could still be hidden beneath the mud? The place had a strange and quiet feeling. It seemed almost as if the swamp had been protecting its secrets for thousands of years. The workers and scientists could feel the importance of what they were uncovering. They were standing on land where people had lived and died thousands of years ago. This was not a recent crime scene. It was an ancient cemetery. Could they have died in some ancient disaster? Or was the swamp hiding something even more unusual? Let's find out. Windover Pond. Windover Pond was no longer just an ordinary swamp. It had become a doorway into a world that existed about 8,000 years ago. And the people from that world had left behind much more than just bones. As the construction machines moved away, the swamp became quiet again. But underneath the surface was a hidden burial ground that had been sealed away by time. It was waiting for scientists to uncover its secrets. And when they finally began removing the layers of soil, they discovered something far more surprising than anyone had expected. Once the pond was drained and the remains were discovered, the case changed from a police investigation into a major archaeological project. That was when the real work began. At first, the area looked like nothing more than a muddy water basin, but underneath, it was much more complicated. The site was covered with thick layers of peat and standing water. In some areas, there were about 6 feet of water sitting on top of nearly 10 feet of waterlogged peat. Beneath all of that were bones and ancient objects that had remained untouched for thousands of years. The excavation was extremely difficult. Normal tools, such as shovels and spades, could easily damage the fragile remains. Dr. Glenn Doran and his colleague David Dickel knew they needed a completely different approach if they wanted to protect what was buried below. So they created a special system to slowly remove the water without disturbing the layers of soil. Around the edges of the site, they installed more than 150 well points. These pipes allowed them to pump water out continuously at a rate of nearly 600 gallons per minute. The pumps ran day and night, slowly lowering the water level until the dark peat finally began to appear. But removing the water created another problem. The peat had to be handled very carefully. It was both a blessing and a challenge. The unusual chemistry of the peat was actually the reason the ancient remains had survived for so long. The bog had very little oxygen and contained natural acids that slowed down the normal process of decay. Because of this, soft tissue and other delicate parts of the bodies had survived in a way that seemed almost impossible in Florida's hot and humid environment. However, the peat was also extremely fragile. If the archaeologists handled it too roughly or allowed it to dry out, the bones hidden inside could quickly break apart. So the excavation team worked almost like surgeons. Instead of using heavy tools, they used small tools, wooden picks, and even chopsticks to carefully remove the layers of peat. They also used spray bottles to keep the bones wet and prevent them from falling apart when exposed to air. In many cases, the skeletons were left pedestaled. This meant the archaeologists carefully removed the soil around a skeleton while leaving enough soil underneath it to support the body in its original position. Every important discovery was photographed and carefully drawn before it was removed from the ground. The process was incredibly slow. It took 3 complete field seasons in 1984, 1985, and 1986 just to uncover about half of the pond. Interestingly, the other half was intentionally left untouched. The archaeologists wanted future scientists to have a chance to study it later, perhaps with better tools and technology. Even with only half of the site explored, the discoveries were already far beyond what anyone expected. During one excavation, a team member noticed something strange inside a human skull. There was a greasy, dark substance inside it. At first, the team joked about what it might be, but when specialists examined the material, they realized it was not simply mud or soil. It was human brain tissue, and it had survived for thousands of years. The discovery stunned everyone. What had started as a joke suddenly became one of the most important discoveries in American archaeology. As the excavation continued, archaeologists found more skulls containing preserved brain material. Some had only tiny traces left, while others contained tissue that could still clearly be identified as brain. By the end of the early excavation seasons, 9 skulls had soft material inside them. Even more amazingly, 5 of those skulls contained brains that were preserved well enough for scientists to see their basic structures. This was something researchers never expected to find in Florida. Normally, the area's heat and moisture destroy organic material within a relatively short time. Yet here, human brain tissue had survived for thousands of years. Scientists then began sending samples for radiocarbon dating. The results added another incredible piece to the story. The bones and peat were between 7,700 and 8,300 years old. The people buried at Windover had lived during the Middle Archaic period, thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt were built. These were not people from recent history. They belonged to a community that lived deep in prehistoric America, more than 7,000 years before the present day. At least 40 people were identified during the early excavations. They included babies, children, adults, and elderly people. Both men and women were buried there. The wide range of people found at the site showed that this was not a random burial place or the result of some sudden disaster. Instead, the area had been used again and again as a cemetery. People had carefully chosen the location and continued using it for generations. The archaeologists expected to find ancient bones, but what they discovered was much more surprising. Inside, some of the skulls were preserved human brains, with their folds and shapes still visible after about 8,000 years. How could soft tissue survive for thousands of years? And what secrets were still hidden inside these ancient brains? Let's find out. Incredible secret beneath the swamp. By the time the main excavations were over, the bog had given up the remains of more than 160 people. Some records put the number closer to 170. Either way, it was clear that this was no small burial site. It was a community cemetery that had been used for hundreds of years. Men, women, children, and even babies had all been carefully buried there. A total of 91 skulls contained preserved brain tissue. Some brains had shrunk into small remains, while others were preserved so well that scientists could still see their shapes and folds under a microscope. Researchers even found signs of nerve fibers and tiny cell structures. This was something nobody expected to find in Florida's hot and wet environment. The idea that human brain tissue could survive for 8,000 years seemed almost impossible. And yet, that was exactly what happened. The Florida bog was hiding an incredible secret. More than 160 prehistoric people had been buried there, and many of their remains had survived in remarkable condition. The preserved brains made Windover one of the most unusual archaeological sites ever discovered. Normally, after thousands of years, only hard bones remain. But at Windover, even soft tissue had survived. Scientists were able to collect DNA from the skeletons and even from some of the preserved brain tissue. This opened the door to research that had once seemed impossible. For the first time, researchers could study the genetics of people who had lived thousands of years ago and learn more about where they came from and how they were connected to other ancient populations. But the graves contained more than just human remains. They also held objects that gave researchers clues about everyday life. Pieces of woven cloth were found in 37 burials. In total, archaeologists recovered 86 pieces of fabric, showing at least 7 different weaving styles. Some were simple mats or coverings, while others showed much more careful work. These fabrics are among the oldest woven materials ever found in the Americas. They showed that the people of Windover had skills that went far beyond simply finding food and staying alive. Other objects gave more clues about how they lived. Archaeologists found spear throwers, sharp projectile points, bone needles, and tools that may have been used for sewing or making baskets. They also discovered shells, seeds, and gourds that may have been used as containers. Wooden stakes had been placed around some of the bodies, possibly to keep them in place in the soft ground. In other graves, branches and sticks had been placed over the remains, almost as if the bodies had been carefully covered and protected. All of this pointed to something important. These were not random burials. The people had carefully planned how their dead would be laid to rest, and there were probably rituals connected to the process. The way the bodies were positioned gave researchers another clue. Many of the dead were found lying on their left side with their arms and legs pulled inward. Most were also facing west. The fact that the same burial position appeared again and again suggests that it had a special meaning for the community. But exactly what that meaning was has been lost over thousands of years. What we do know is that these people did not simply throw their dead into the ground. They followed traditions, and traditions usually come from shared beliefs, values, and customs. Perhaps the most touching evidence came from the bones themselves. One skeleton belonged to a teenage boy who had suffered from spina bifida, a serious condition affecting the spine. Even though he had a disability, he survived long enough to reach his teenage years. That tells us something powerful about the people around him. Someone must have helped him get food. Someone must have protected him. Someone must have cared for him when life was already difficult for everyone. Thousands of years ago, survival was not easy. So the fact that this boy lived into adolescence suggests that his community was willing to care for someone who could not live as easily or independently as others. This showed that Windover was more than a group of hunters simply trying to survive. It was a real community. They cared for their vulnerable members, respected their traditions, and treated their dead with care. And when scientists put all the evidence together, the brains, bones, clothing, tools, and other objects, a much clearer picture began to appear. These people had a society with traditions and rituals. They made woven cloth. They hunted with specialized tools. They cared for the sick and disabled. And when someone died, they took the time to bury that person properly. Their cemetery was not simply a place where bodies were left behind. It was a place of remembrance. Yet, even as archaeologists slowly began rebuilding the story of this ancient community, one major mystery still remained. How did human brains survive for 8,000 years? And who were these mysterious people whose DNA did not closely match any group alive today? Let's find out. Genetic clues of Windover. Researchers carefully took samples from both the bones and the preserved brain tissue. They were able to recover mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mothers to their children. In some cases, they also recovered nuclear DNA, which gives scientists a much more complete picture of a person's ancestry. The people of Windover carried genetic markers that connected them to ancient populations from Asia. This supported the idea that some of the first people to reach the Americas had traveled across the ancient land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska. The DNA from the Windover people did not closely match any Native American population living today. And this left scientists with a difficult question. If modern Native American groups descended from those early migrations, why did the Windover people have genetic patterns that seemed to disappear over time? Was their DNA simply a rare variation that existed among a much larger population? Or had an entire human family line disappeared from history? Scientists could not give a clear answer, but the discovery raised an even bigger question about how complicated human history in North America really was. And there was more. Some of the DNA evidence suggested that several people buried at Windover were related. Scientists found a small DNA variation, known as an allele, in more than one individual. This was an important clue, because it suggested that family members had been buried at the same site. That made one thing much clearer. Windover was not a place where people were buried all at once after some terrible event. It was a cemetery that a community returned to again and again over many generations. Families came back to the same pond to bury their dead. Over time, the place became much more than a burial site. It became a special place where people remembered their loved ones. Radiocarbon dating showed just how old this tradition was. The remains were between about 7,800 and 8,300 years old, placing them in what archaeologists call the Middle Archaic period. This was thousands of years before farming became common in North America. It was also long before large settlements, powerful chiefs, and cities appeared. These people were not simply wandering around with no organized way of life. They had social systems. They made woven fabrics. They cared for people who were sick or injured. And they followed traditions that continued for generations. In a major research paper, Dr. Glenn Doran and his colleagues explained how the unusually preserved soft tissue at Windover had protected tiny remains of cells and usable DNA. This made Windover one of the oldest sites in the world, where scientists could directly study ancient genetic material. For archaeologists and genetic researchers, it was almost like looking through a window into a part of human history that had nearly disappeared. And the importance of the discovery went far beyond Florida. If the Windover people belonged to a human group that left no living descendants, then the history of the first people in the Americas may have been much more complicated than scientists once thought. Different groups could have arrived, lived in the region for hundreds or even thousands of years, and eventually disappeared without leaving a clear genetic trace in modern populations. This changed the way scientists looked at early American history. Instead of assuming that every early population simply developed into one of the later Native American tribes, the evidence suggested something much more complicated. There may have been waves of migration, periods of isolation, communities that disappeared, and entire family lines that eventually became extinct. When scientists combined the DNA evidence with the clothing, tools, and unusual burial practices found at Windover, they began to see a picture of a community that was independent, organized, and very different from the groups that came later. These people were connected to the ancient migrations that brought humans into the Americas. But at the same time, they seemed to stand apart from many later populations. They were part of the larger story of humanity, yet their own story had almost completely disappeared. If their DNA tells a story that does not clearly connect them to any living Native American group, then who exactly were the people of Windover? And why did their family line disappear? Let's find out. Brain tissue discovery. Nearly 90 of the skeletons found at Windover still had some form of brain tissue. In some cases, only small, dried-up pieces remained, but in others, the tissue still showed the folds and patterns normally found in a human brain. These folds were so detailed in their shape and size that it was hard to believe they could have been caused by practices like head binding or skull deformation. One discovery stood out from the rest. Archaeologists called it Burial 82. Inside the skull was a brain that had survived in remarkable condition. One scientist even described it as beautiful. The brain had shrunk to perhaps 1/3 of its original size, but its familiar folds and ridges were still visible. These were the same patterns that had once been part of a living person's ability to remember, speak, and feel emotions. Looking at it was almost like seeing a tiny piece of someone's mind from more than 8,000 years ago. When researchers examined Burial 82 under a microscope, they found even more surprising details. They discovered remains of nerve fibers and traces of tiny cell structures. This meant they were not simply looking at an empty skull. They were looking at preserved human tissue that still showed parts of the complicated network that had once controlled a living person's body. At that moment, the discovery became much more personal. Scientists were no longer studying ordinary ancient skeletons. They were looking directly at the preserved brain of someone who had lived, worked, and eventually died in Florida thousands of years before written history. Florida's heat and humidity normally destroy organic material very quickly. Under normal conditions, soft tissue would disappear within a short time. Yet these brains had survived for thousands of years. The peat was highly acidic and contained very little oxygen. When the bodies were placed into this environment, the bog acted almost like a natural preservative. It slowed down the normal decay caused by bacteria and other microorganisms. Minerals in the surrounding water may have helped too. They could have entered the tissue, making it harder and more stable instead of allowing it to completely break down. But the timing of the burials was also important. The condition of the bodies suggested that the people were placed into the bog very soon after death, possibly within a day or two. Because of this, decomposition had very little time to get started. Once the bodies were underwater, the bog became a kind of natural tomb. It protected them from oxygen, sunlight, and other forces that normally destroy human remains. The preserved brains were important for another reason. Scientists now had a rare chance to compare the brains of people who lived thousands of years ago with those of humans today. They could study the ancient tissue for possible signs of disease, unusual development, or other features that may have changed over thousands of years. What once seemed impossible had suddenly become possible in a quiet Florida swamp. When the findings were published in scientific journals, scientists around the world became interested. A 1986 report in Nature described Windover as one of the oldest known examples of preserved brain tissue containing DNA that could still be studied. Suddenly, Windover was no longer just an unusual archaeological site in Florida. Archaeologists, genetic researchers, and medical scientists all began looking closely at Windover, hoping these ancient remains could reveal even more secrets about the people who lived there more than 8,000 years ago. How many other ancient burial sites might be hidden in bogs that have disappeared or changed over time? Was Windover a rare exception, or did other communities across the ancient Americas also use similar places to bury and preserve their dead? Let's take a closer look. The woman with DNA. Burial 82 was identified as a woman who lived nearly 8,000 years ago. She was about 45 years old when she died. Her left ear can still be seen, and if you look closely, there is a small wooden plug pushed through a hole in her earlobe. The plug would have helped keep the hole open. Her bones revealed that she had lived a long and difficult life. Signs of arthritis were found in her spine and hands, suggesting that she had done a lot of hard physical work and carried heavy loads. Her teeth were badly worn from eating rough, coarse foods. Marks on her pelvis showed that she had given birth several times, showing that she had been a mother. Even with all these hardships, she had lived longer than many other people from her time. That suggested she may have been strong and resilient, and perhaps had an important or respected place in her community. But what made this woman truly remarkable was not what scientists found in her bones. It was what they discovered inside her skull. Her brain had shrunk to only a small part of its original size, but it had still kept some of its folds, membranes, and delicate structures. When scientists examined it, they could see the ridges that had once been part of her living brain. Under a microscope, the tissue even showed traces of nerve fibers and patterns of cells that should have disappeared thousands of years ago. To the researchers, it almost seemed as though her brain had been sealed away for thousands of years, waiting for someone to discover it. Then the mystery became even greater. Scientists took DNA samples from her brain tissue and bone marrow. Most ancient remains found in the Americas belong to 5 well-documented mitochondrial DNA groups, known as A, B, C, D, and X. These groups are genetic family lines that help scientists understand how ancient people moved from Asia into the Americas. But this woman's DNA did not fit into any of those groups. Instead, scientists found a rare genetic marker that did not clearly match any known population in North or South America. At first, they wondered if the result was simply a mistake. But then, something even more surprising happened. 2 other people buried at Windover were later found to have the same unusual genetic marker. They had been buried in different parts of the pond, and they were not closely related to the woman or to each other. That made it much harder to explain the result as a family trait, and that raised some serious questions. Could there once have been a group of early Americans that completely disappeared, leaving no direct descendants? Were they wiped out by disease, conflict, or major changes in their environment? Or did their genetic identity slowly disappear as they mixed with other groups that spread across the continent? The woman from Windover was already extraordinary because of her preserved brain. But her DNA added another mystery, one that challenged the simplest ideas about how the first people spread across the Americas. Her brain itself also showed some unusual features. Scientists noticed small differences in its shape. Her frontal lobes appeared slightly larger than expected, and the 2 sides of her brain were not perfectly symmetrical in the same way seen in many modern populations. These differences were not signs of disease. Instead, they raised the possibility that they were natural traits passed down through the unusual genetic line to which she may have belonged. In other words, this ancient woman's skull may have preserved more than just her brain. So, what do you think about the shocking revelation of the DNA of an 8,000-year-old skull? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe.